My name is Ditte Steffensen, and I'm the Sourcing Hub Manager, meaning I'm responsible for updating the Sourcing Hub and checking in stakeholder comments for all the risk assessments we have uploaded. I'm going to give you a brief presentation on our timber legality risk assessment framework and process for developing the risk assessments before moving on to the presentations on the actual findings on China. I assume most of you are familiar with the EUTR requirements or other kinds of due diligence requirements for companies where it's required to ensure that supply chains are legal, timber supply chains are legal. Our risk assessment operate at a national level, so we identify legal requirements and associated risk at a national level. And the intention is to use these findings for supply chains. So it'll give you an idea what kind of risk you can experience as a buyer from China. And our risk assessments are based on our risk assessment framework. As a basis, we've identified categories of legislation that we find are applicable to the legality of timber. So it's legal right to harvest, taxes and fees, timber harvesting activities, trade and transport, and third parties' rights. And these categories of rights are similar to what is defined in the EUTR as relevant for legal timber, for legality of timber. We have then gone a step further and split these overall categories into subcategories, meaning, for example, for timber harvesting activities, that we have timber harvesting regulations, so specifically for the activity of harvesting the timber, but also take into account protected sites and species, environmental requirement, and also health and safety and legal employment for the forestry workers. And we've gone through this step for each of these overall categories and defined what does it actually mean when we say timber harvesting activities. This allows us to be very systematic and detailed for all the risk assessments. So whenever you download one of our risk assessment, we will have evaluated each of these steps or subcategories. And we do that by identifying the legal requirements, first of all, like the legislation, and do a description of the legal requirements. We identify the applicable the applicable documents and the applicable authorities. And then, very key for the risk assessments, we identify the risks related to the legal requirements. If we then identify a risk, we also propose mitigation measures on how you can address these risks. And I'll get back to that a bit later, and Gao Dong will specify even further on that for China. And talking about risks, for each of the subcategories we identify, we either conclude low risk or specified risk. First of all, it should be mentioned that there are no countries where there are no risks. There's always some level of risk. But if these risks are just temporary, if they are unusual, non-systematic, if they're very limited in impact, and if they are being effectively controlled and monitored by the authorities, then we consider that as a low risk. But on the other hand, if it affects a wide area, causes significant damage and continues over a long period of time, if it indicates an absence or breakdown of the legal system, if it's not followed up and corrected when identified, or it has a very severe negative impact, then we say this is a specified risk. And we call this a specified risk because it can be a very high risk, but it can also be an indication of risk. Our approach with this risk assessment is to actually prove low risk. So if we're not able to say that we have enough knowledge to say this is low risk, then we conclude that there is a specified risk. And we do this because when we say low risk, we also tell companies that there's no need for further follow-up action. You can just source from that country without further mitigation measures. But if we're not able to prove low risk, then we say there is a specified risk and you have to pay attention. We will usually say it's based on a precautionary approach. So if you look into our risk assessment, it will be clear what our risk conclusion is based on. The risk assessment development process in itself is a rather long process and could take about 6 months, but also up to 1.5 to 2 years, depending on the country. We, of course, start by developing the assessment framework, and we have that in place. Select commodity and jurisdiction, and in this case, we're talking about China and timber. We then engage a local expert. So if we have staff in that country who's knowledgeable on legality and the timber sector, then we work with our own staff, but otherwise we engage with a local consultant. We then carry out a draft risk assessment, and in that process, so step 4 and 5, we take into account experts and stakeholders to close potential gaps. So a risk assessment, I should say, is a desk-based risk assessment. We do not go into the field and do field observation as such. So we take into account all the public information that we can find. This can be decision by law, it can be government report, it can be NGO reports. Basically, we try to pull in all public information. But very often there will be gaps. Some of our subcategories that we have to evaluate is not necessarily covered, and that's where we talk to experts in the process of developing the risk assessment. We also engage with stakeholders to evaluate whether it's a low risk or specified risk. So if there could be a news article pointing out that there's been some illegal harvesting, but if this is a one case, then that will not result in a specified risk. Once we are happy with the report, we make sure it's edited, and I say translated here because we have an English version available. So if it's developed in the local language, we'll translate it into English, and then we'll put it into public consultation on our sourcing hub. For some countries, we've gone on site and had a public consultation workshop as well, but that will depend on the budget available, and it also has to be safe. So in these corona times, it's not something we prioritize. We then take into account the stakeholder feedback we receive, and we publish the report on our sourcing hub. So that's where you'll be able to find all our risk assessments. Even after the risk assessment has been published, it's possible to provide feedback. We have on our sourcing hub, we have a feedback function where you can let us know if you know there's some new legislation in place, or if you identify a mistake in the report or do not agree with the findings. So it's always possible and very welcoming if you provide feedback along the way. And we have a series of specific legality tools developed for all countries, not necessarily the ones already updated, but all newer risk assessment will be followed by a set of tools. And we've done that because we have these timber legality risk assessment, which can be very long, detailed reports. So there's a lot of good knowledge in there, but it can also be a long process to go through the whole report. So we have developed a series of tools, and the first one is the list of applicable legislation. And here we just taken out all the relevant legislation for timber legality as we see it. We also have a risk mitigation guide, which has all the risks we have identified listed, and then all the mitigation measures that we suggest to apply included. In this risk mitigation guide, you will not see the background on how we reach these risks. So you would have to go back to our full risk assessment for that. The risk mitigation guide is more, I guess, the conclusion you can say on what we identified in the risk assessment. And lastly, we have a document guide, which is the documents we consider as relevant when you are conducting due diligence. So there will be a copy of the documents and a short description of what this document contains and what to be aware of when you are developing due diligence or when you are implementing due diligence. And all of this you will be able to find on the sourcing hub. There's a link here. And you just have to click the timber icon when you enter the page, and it'll take you to a world map where you can find each of the countries you're interested in. Mikael earlier said we have over 65 risk assessment developed, but we actually have currently 71 risk assessment approved and 1 in public consultation. So we are continually expanding the scope of the countries covered by risk assessments. And as for China, we developed the first risk assessment for China in 2017. That's when it was published on the Sourcing Hub. We've done the risk assessment only for mainland China. And as there's been some updates in the legal framework in China, we started the development of a second version of the risk assessment in 2019, October 2019. We had 3 rounds of consultation while developing the risk assessment. So we discussed the risk assessment and the findings with experts from the China Academy of Forestry, talked to forest authorities at different levels, state and private forest management entities, NGOs, different associations, and certification schemes. And this has really strengthened our belief in the conclusions we made on the risk assessment. And we were able to publish it in April 2021. So it's a relatively new report. We had it out for public consultation in end of January till end of March, and received some very good feedback from stakeholders in that process. And yeah, here's a link. You will get the slides later on, and I included links specifically to each of the tools we developed for China. So we have the Legality risk assessment in English available, and then we have the risk mitigation guide in English and in Chinese, and we have a document guide in English. And lastly, we have the list of applicable legislation in both English and Chinese. And with that, I will end my presentation and give the word to Gaojun unless there are any questions.